Good morning, bonjour. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about the early part of human evolution. Unlike the depictions such as these of fossil modern humans and Neanderthals that are similar to us in many respects, I'll be focusing on the beginnings of the human lineage when we think species looked a lot more like this image on the right. Many consider them as simply bipedal apes with whom we would have little in common either anatomically or behaviorally. The main point that I want to make in this talk is that we should not bestow onto these early species behaviors for which we are uncertain, because they set the benchmark for species that come later, species which almost certainly are more sophisticated in terms of cognition, behavior, and technology. We know from genetic studies that humans share a close evolutionary relationship with living chimpanzees and bonobos, and that the split between our lineage and theirs occurred approximately 6 million years ago. Despite chimpanzees having evolved over the last 6 million years themselves, I think it is reasonable to suggest that the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees had a greater resemblance with them than with us. And this view influences depictions of the earliest hominins in terms of their general body shape, degree of hair, and aspects of their face, such as the nose and mouth. The geological period that I'll focus on is the Pliocene, from approximately 5 to 2.5 million years ago. And during this period, the only place that we have evidence for fossil hominin species is in Africa. Although we have thousands of hominin fossils from the Pliocene period, it is also the period for which we have the greatest uncertainty about what these hominins looked like and how they behaved. How did they move around their environment? What type of tools did they make and use? What did they eat? What was their group structure? And how did they communicate? Because we share a common ancestry with chimpanzees and bonobos, I want to remind you of some of the behavioral characteristics that might reasonably be assumed to be present in the earliest members of our lineage. Chimpanzees live in multi-male, multi-female groups with a hierarchical social structure. The chimpanzee diet is focused on the eating of fruits, but additionally they crack nuts, forage for honey, dig for termites, and opportunistically eat a variety of invertebrates. And they also occasionally hunt for other primates, such as bush babies and colobus monkeys. They exist in a variety of habitats, and in addition to the terrestrial quadrupedal locomotion, they are frequently arboreal for feeding and nest building. Additionally, there are complex social dynamics in both chimpanzee and bonobo communities, and I would highlight Jane Goodall's view that they seem to possess emotional responses similar to humans in terms of excitement, fear, anxiety, empathy, and anger. Of course, few would suggest that the earliest hominins were identical to chimpanzees, either anatomically or behaviorally, but I think that there is value in acknowledging that these fundamental aspects of chimpanzee lifeways were likely present in the earliest hominins. Here's a summary of most of the fossil hominin species recognized today, and you can see that many originate during the Pliocene and persist into the Pleistocene. Today I will be focusing on 4 groups highlighted here. I will highlight key aspects of their anatomy and behavior and draw your attention to new discoveries and novel analyses that are changing how we might choose to present them to the public. The first group that I would like to speak about are represented by a single genus called Australopithecus. The discovery of Australopithecus was exciting for a couple of reasons. First, it was very well dated to between 5.8 and 4.4 million years ago, and thus predated the very well-known Australopithecines. Second, the main discovery was an almost complete skeleton that preserved most of the major regions of the body, and thus allowed a comprehensive assessment of how Australopithecus moved around its environment. The most striking and unexpected aspect of its skeleton was a grasping big toe. The combination of a pelvis adapted for walking on 2 legs when on the ground, with an ape-like grasping foot, and a hand with long, curved fingers, provided a key insight into the manner in which hominin bipedalism evolved. Furthermore, it was direct evidence that the ability to grasp branches with the feet was retained for a significant period after the split of the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. This indicates that Australopithecus regularly accessed both arboreal and terrestrial environments, and this has influenced our perception of what they looked like and the ecological niche that they filled. Importantly, no stone tools have been found in association with Australopithecus, and the isotopic analyses of its teeth indicates a diet dominated by so-called C3 plants, like fruits, in a woodland environment. The next group that I would like to discuss is Australopithecus. First discovered as an infant skull in 1924 in the Tong Lime Works in the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa, there were decades of debate as to whether this specimen belonged to a fossil hominin species or was a fossil ape. Later discoveries, such as STS5 from Sterkfontein, Lucy from Ethiopia in 1974, and most recently Littlefoot, also from Sterkfontein, have left no doubt as to the hominin status of these species. Australopithecus is extremely well known to the general public, due in large part to its perception as a link between living apes and humans and the prominent role that it tends to play in museum exhibits and in film and media about human evolution. There are three important considerations regarding the presentation of Australopithecus to the public. The first is to what degree tree climbing remained a key component of their locomotor repertoire. This debate is at least 40 years old and is represented very well by these two depictions highlighted by Stern. It is also strongly linked to the famous depiction based on the Laetoli footprints of two Australopithecus walking as a couple across the landscape. The issue is that there are aspects of the skeleton, particularly in the pelvis and lower limbs, that indicate that Australopithecus was efficient at walking on two legs when on the ground. However, other aspects of the skeleton, such as relatively long arms, curved fingers, and aspects of the shoulder, indicate that they might have continued to exploit an arboreal environment. The debate centers around whether these climbing features are simply retained and have not been removed yet by natural selection, or whether their presence indicates a reliance on the ability to climb effectively. A recent study by Kappelman and colleagues suggested that the famous Lucy skeleton preserved evidence of trauma associated with a fall from a great height, presumably a tree. And the reason this study appeared in Nature, our top international scientific journal, was because it was directly relevant to this debate about whether Australopithecus still climbed trees. Clearly, if it fell out of one, the authors suggest it did. And personally, I'm swayed by the argument that the mosaic nature of the Australopithecus skeleton tells us that both terrestrial and arboreal environments were important for its success, and that selection acted on the morphology of its whole skeleton to maintain this dual capacity. The second important issue is the degree to which Australopithecus may have produced and used stone tools. Previously, there was no evidence to suggest that tool manufacture and use in Australopithecus differed from that present in chimpanzees. However, McFerrin and colleagues published two cut-marked bones from Ethiopia, dated to 3.4 million years ago, and the only hominin species around at this time belonged to Australopithecus. More recently, Harmon and colleagues discovered the earliest stone tool industry, referred to as the Lomacquian, that overlap in time with Australopithecus and, crucially, predate the appearance of early Homo species. The purposeful production and use of stone flakes was previously a hallmark of our own genus Homo. But if it was also done by Australopithecus, then our understanding of their ecological niche fundamentally changes. The fact remains, however, that there is no direct evidence of stone tool manufacture and use in Australopithecus, and it would be prudent to remain cautious in attributing this behavior to them, particularly given the increasing taxonomic diversity around 3 million years ago. The final and related issue that I would like to raise about Australopithecus is the degree to which animal protein formed a substantive part of their diet. The chemical signatures of their teeth indicate that they were consuming C4 foods in an increasing amount. This signal could come from eating plants, such as sedges or grasses, but also from animals such as small and large vertebrates, termites, and even birds' eggs. The potential contribution of animal protein has been increased by the discovery of the cut-marked bones from Dakika, indicating the removal of meat from bovid skeletons. One way to resolve this debate is to determine where in the trophic level Australopithecus was through nitrogen levels in their tissues. Ludek and colleagues have recently managed to measure nitrogen levels in Australopithecus africanus from South Africa and suggest that their diet to be predominantly plant-based and unlike that of carnivores. However, only 7 teeth have been analyzed so far, and the variation found in those teeth is quite high. The ability to extract trophic level signal from Pliocene hominin teeth is extremely exciting, and has great potential to improve our understanding of subsistence strategies of different hominin species. One of the most unexpected discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology was the discovery of a group of hominins we call Paranthropus, which means beside human. They were striking because while they had brains that were similar in size to Australopithecus, the bones of their face and jaws were massively robust, and their teeth were incredibly large. They are found in both eastern and southern Africa and indicate widespread, prolonged selection for the production of heavy chewing. Their diet tends to be dominated by C4 plants, particularly in eastern Africa, and one theory is that underground tubers were a major dietary food source. With the possible exception of bone tools for digging termites, there is little direct evidence of stone tool production and use in this group. And curiously, about 1 million years ago, they disappear. They tend to be depicted as being broadly similar to Australopithecus, but with bigger faces. But they were a distinct lineage that remained separated from both Australopithecus and early Homo for almost 1.5 million years. And from an evolutionary perspective, this would suggest that they had a fundamentally different ecological niche from Australopithecus. However, this is not reflected in their depictions in museums and textbooks. One of the problems we have with solving this issue is that we have almost no postcranial fossils, so below the head, that are definitively attributed to Paranthropus. One important set of remains was recently discovered in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. The associated teeth are large, and thus Paranthropus, and the bones of the forearm, such as the radius you see here, are very curved and robust. And this is similar to what we see in chimpanzees and linked to tree climbing. However, any other insights into their locomotor behavior, besides the assumption that it was predominantly a terrestrial biped, has been lacking. But there is a source of evidence hidden in the skeleton that can help us understand how a species moved around. We use microcomputed tomography to examine the internal structure of bones, and particularly the spongy or trabecular bone found in the end of long bones. When humans and other primates move around, this bony structure remodels to maintain bone strength, and thus we can use this pattern of remodeling to reconstruct the positions in which the joints of a primate were predominantly loaded. We applied this technique to 2 hip bones from the site of Sterkfontein, South Africa, that were discovered over 60 years ago. One belongs to Australopithecus, and the other we think belongs to Paranthropus. And based on the examination of their external shape, they've always been interpreted to reflect a similar style of bipedal locomotion, and this is how things have stood since their discovery in the 1950s. We became interested in re-examining these fossils after demonstrating that the locomotor differences between humans and chimpanzees are reflected in the structure of their hip bones. Specifically, humans have one predominant pillar in the head of their femur, linked to heel strike during walking or running. Chimpanzees and gorillas, on the other hand, have 2 pillars, one associated with walking quadrupedally on the ground, and one associated with a highly flexed hip during climbing. We found that the Australopithecus femur had the human-like single pillar, while quite unexpectedly, the Paranthropus femur had a double pillar. And we interpret this as direct evidence that this individual moved around its environment in a fundamentally different way to Australopithecus. And specifically, this would suggest that it spent a considerable amount of time climbing, likely for food and/or predator avoidance. Having evidence for different locomotor behavior could explain why Paranthropus existed as a separate lineage alongside both Australopithecus and the first Homo species for hundreds of thousands of years. Furthermore, this evidence should inform how we present Paranthropus to the public and demonstrate that there are different ways of being a hominin during the Pliocene. Finally, I want to speak about the appearance of our own genus Homo about 2.5 million years ago. In the 1960s, Homo erectus was well accepted based on discoveries in the 1890s in Indonesia and in China in the 1930s. In Tanzania, Mary and Louis Leakey had been looking for the maker of stone tools discovered at Olduvai Gorge. Mary Leakey discovered the Zinjanthropus cranium in 1959, which can be seen as a representative of Paranthropus. Then in the early 1960s, they discovered a series of fossils in bed 1 at Olduvai Gorge referred to as OH7. These included a juvenile mandible, the parietals of a cranium, a partial hand, and an associated, very human-like partial foot called OH8. Collectively, this material was published in 1964 as Homo habilis, or handyman, and it has since been portrayed as the first evidence of a major evolutionary transition in the human lineage from Australopithecus, based on an increase in brain size, a reduction in tooth size, an increase in the manipulative ability and production of stone tools, and a modern bipedal gait. This emphasis on derived and more modern human-like aspects of Homo habilis has strongly influenced its presentation to the general public. In terms of their lifestyle, we associate Homo habilis with the core and flake lithic tradition called the Oldowan, and recognize the cognitive sophistication and skill that is needed to produce, for example, the reduction sequences seen at the 2.3 million-year-old site of Lokalale. Given the historical emphasis on the derived aspects of Australopithecus, such as being an obligate biped in a savanna-type environment, it is no surprise that Homo habilis tends to be placed firmly on the ground, exploiting a variety of terrestrial resources and relying on increasing brain size and technology to prosper. However, almost all of the characteristics that have been championed as differentiating Homo habilis from Australopithecus are being challenged. For example, there are a number of Homo habilis specimens that have brain sizes that are similar to Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and even Homo erectus. And we now have the complicating factors of chimpanzee-like brain size in both Homo naledi from South Africa and Homo floresiensis from Indonesia. So it is difficult to see brain size as a definitive difference among these taxa. Second, the hand skeleton of Homo habilis is actually very poorly preserved, as you can see here. And in many respects, it retains primitive features associated with climbing, including John Napier's original observation that the aspects of the finger bones were very similar to those of a gorilla. Third, like Paranthropus, we have little idea of what the postcranial skeleton of Homo habilis looked like, and the few partial remains we do have, such as the OH62 skeleton, suggest that it might have had relatively long arms, also indicative of climbing. Most recently, Fred Spoor and colleagues' analysis of the original mandible noted similarities in shape with Australopithecus compared to Homo erectus, and our analysis of tooth size suggests that there is little to differentiate the teeth of Homo habilis from Australopithecus, both in eastern and southern Africa. And finally, because of the Lomacui tools and the cut mark bones from Dakika that I mentioned earlier, the manufacture and use of stone flakes may not be limited to members of the genus Homo. So although there is good evidence that fossils currently attributed to Homo habilis are different both in geological age and some aspects of morphology from Australopithecus, it is unclear on what basis we can differentiate their behavior. Indeed, this has led to the suggestion that it might be more appropriate to refer to these fossils as Australopithecus habilis. And doing so would be a fundamental shift in our perception of this group, and there would be a renewed emphasis on Homo erectus, representing the key transition from Australopithecus to the origins of our genus. The Pliocene period is striking for the diversity of hominin groups that are present. Ardipithecus provides a window into the evolution of the key hominin trait of bipedalism. Australopithecus could represent the origins of a number of key behaviors, such as stone tool manufacture and meat eating, but considerably more work needs to be done to clarify this. Paranthropus was a distinct lineage that demonstrates the fact that our evolution was not a simple linear transition. And what is so valuable about Paranthropus, besides being a fascinating group whose lifeways we need to understand better, is that it highlights the importance of continuing to look for fossils, because until it was found, it never would have been predicted to exist. Regarding Homo habilis, when it was first discovered, it was reasonable to contrast it so clearly against Australopithecus. But since then, new fossils and new discoveries and analyses are blurring any clear line between these groups. At the beginning of this talk, I stressed the importance of not bestowing onto these Pliocene hominin species behaviors for which we are uncertain, because they set the benchmark for species that come later. And it is useful to consider how our perception of these groups has changed over time. Of course, Ardipithecus is a very recent genus, but we can compare it to this 1965 reconstruction of Oreopithecus. And there are similarities in terms of relative brain size, limb proportions, and a grasping toe. What is worth noting about Ardipithecus, I think, is that the partial skeleton has very few of the joints preserved, highlighted here by red circles. and it will be interesting to see if future discoveries alter our perceptions of how it moved around its environment and its evolutionary relationship to Australopithecus. Here is a wonderful reconstruction of Australopithecus by Burian from 1960, contrasted against a recent reimagination by John Gurche. In the early reconstruction, there was an emphasis on the terrestrial nature of the genus, and conversely, being at least partially in an arboreal environment contributes to many modern reconstructions, and is a better reflection, I think, of its skeletal anatomy. Here are two more controversial images from around 1990. The first reconstructs Lucy in a very human-like running pose that I'm not sure would be produced today. And the second depicts the application of clay in a symbolic form, which again is highly speculative and based, I expect, in the desire to link Australopithecus to modern humans at that time. Even though they were first described in the 1930s, I could not find many reconstructions which depicted the lifeways of Paranthropus. When they are imaged, it tends to be limited to a basic body plan of an upright Australopithecus-type creature with big jaws, with some resemblance to gorillas. I think this one on the right by John Gurche is an improvement, primarily as it depicts Paranthropus doing something, in this case accessing a tuber, and is effective at highlighting the behavioral differences that make them unique. As I noted previously, I think we may have new evidence for a fundamentally different locomotor strategy in Paranthropus that may influence reconstructions in the future. Images of Homo habilis have been quite consistent over the years, partly due, I suspect, to a lack of additional finds, such as a complete skeleton, that may shed more light on its locomotion and behavior. It has been desirable to differentiate them from Australopithecus, and I think to some extent the Oldowan toolkit does this. Deciding to place habilis fossils into Australopithecus would have a profound impact on their public presentation. Another, perhaps preferable option would be to create a new genus to differentiate these specimens and recognize that there is a behavioral shift from Australopithecus, but that they also may not epitomize the characteristics that signal the origin of the genus Homo. Regardless, they remain one of the most difficult species to visualize, with contrasting arguments to make them more primitive and Australopithecus-like, or more derived and Homo erectus-like. I have great admiration for the artists that strive to visualize individuals and scenes from our past. The images and sculptures they create are a key component to public understanding of human evolution. And I'm confident that new discoveries will continue to refine our understanding of the lifeways of these early human ancestors that lived in the Pliocene. And these will provide key pieces in the puzzle that will reveal when, where, and how we became the humans we are today. In closing, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Hublin for the invitation to speak today, and to all those who have contributed to the organization of the symposium, and for your attention. Thank you.